Good afternoon. My name is Kim Ponzio, and I'd like to welcome you to the July webinar for the Society of Wetland Scientists. Today's webinar is special because it is our very first co-hosted webinar. If I could get the next slide, please. We've joined forces with one of our sister organizations, the Society for Ecological Restoration, to host this webinar concerning both wetland and upland restoration projects. We have both SWS and SER members in attendance today. I am a former president of SWS and the current chair of the webinar committee, and I want to introduce my co-host, Rebecca Shore from SER.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. I'm the Communications Associate with the Society for Ecological Restoration based out of DC.
Well, both SER and SWS are international organizations. SWS was founded in 1980 and we now have over 3,000 members hailing from 62 different countries.
And SER was founded a few years later in 1988, and we currently have 2,700 members from over 70 countries, and this year is a very special year. It's our 30th anniversary, and both of our groups have a diverse membership hailing from all sectors of wetland science and ecological restoration, including practitioners, academics, and students.
And for those of you who may not be aware, SWS and SER entered into a memorandum of cooperation in October of 2016. And this is to collectively leverage our resources, of which our members are our most important resource, to further both our missions. So teaming up with SER just makes sense given that our missions are overlapping and they include ecological restoration and building resilience in both wetland and upland ecosystems.
Our societies have lots of different member benefits, including we both have our own flagship peer-reviewed journals. So SWS has the journal Wetlands, as well as the applied trade publication Wetland Science and Practice, and SER has Restoration Ecology, which itself is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year.
So whether you're a member of SWS or SER or both, like I am, you have access to a variety of member benefits, including but not limited to the ones that you see listed here. And we're proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by both the SWS and the SER professional certification programs. So that means it's applicable for continuing education credits that can be applied to either your professional wetland scientist certification or your certified ecological restoration professional certification.
All right, so before we get started and introduce our speakers, we'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So the general format of today's webinar will be about a 40 to 45-minute presentation by both of our speakers, followed by about 15 minutes of question and answer from you, the attendees. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by typing your answers into the questions pane in your control panel. And we just ask that you specify which speaker you're addressing a specific question to, or if it's to both of them. Kim and I are going to act as moderators, and we will ask these questions to our presenters at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording immediately following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to fill out the evaluation survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. This will help us plan future events and hopefully have more collaboration between our two organizations.
And if you'd like a copy of today's slides, including all of the intro and closeout slides so that you have email addresses and websites, go ahead and find a PDF copy in the handout section of the control pane. And also, if you're tech savvy, unlike me, I am not, please use the hashtag SWS webinar to tweet about today's co-hosted webinar. So I want to go ahead and take the test out the questions pane, and then we'll find out about who's participating today. So if you would type in the state or country you're participating from and which society or societies you're affiliated with. So I see, let's see, I see Florida, Oregon, SWS, SER, Canada, a couple of from Canada, and have several members that look like they're in both organizations, Pennsylvania, Nebraska. Looks like we have some a lot of inside the U.S. and outside of the country. So, okay, with that, with the logistics out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and get our webinar started. So it's my pleasure to welcome today's first co-presenter, Kevin Du Bois. Kevin is a certified professional wetland scientist, a professional wetland delineator, and a certified floodplain manager. Over his career, Mr. Du Bois has worked as a state fisheries biologist, a sensitive land acquisition specialist, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service endangered species biologist, a wetland regulator, and an environmental educator. Mr. Du Bois has worked for the Navy for 2+ years, providing installation and regional level services as a NEPA, Natural Resources and Cultural Resources Project Manager. Mr. Du Bois currently serves as the DoD Chesapeake Bay Program Coordinator. He has decades of experience in wetland restoration and is a recognized leader in the design and construction of living shorelines. He also participates in a number of environmental NGOs.
All right, co-presenting with Kevin today is Kevin Irwin. Mr. Irwin is an internationally recognized Ecological Society of America certified senior ecologist, specializing in large-scale wetland restoration, biodiversity conservation, and watershed evaluation. His first wetland restoration project was in 1974, and since then he has evaluated, designed, managed, constructed, and monitored hundreds of projects around the world. Since 1980, he's served as the president and principal ecologist of Kevin L. Irwin Consulting Ecologists, Inc., and is also a courtesy faculty member of the Florida Gulf Coast University. He has served a variety of appointed positions, recently as a member of the Ramsar Scientific and Technical Review Panel, and was a member of the Wetland International's Supervisory Council. He has served as an international expert, wetland scientist, and ecologist in a variety of appointed and elected positions.
All right, so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and let our speakers take it away. First, Kevin Du Bois will be giving his presentation on living shoreline. So Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
Good afternoon, and thanks to SER and SWS for allowing me to present today. What I'd like to talk about is the use of living shorelines for nature-based shoreline protection. And really, my role with living shorelines came about looking at alternatives for hardened shoreline protection. And I think it's important to recognize too that this is not a new idea. At least in Virginia, the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science have been promoting the use of living shoreline techniques at least since the 1990s. For whatever reason, they fell out of favor. And hardened shoreline techniques really came to be the most prevalent, but we'll talk about that just a little bit and why we're looking at living shorelines again. So as you can see in Virginia and elsewhere across the United States, since colonial times, wetlands have been lost. In Virginia, about half of the wetlands were lost between 1780 and 1980. And the graph on the right, even though it's old, 1987, you can see the sources of those historic losses were urban, which really means they were filled to create developable upland, or they were converted to coastal waters, which means they were dredged. So most of the losses were a result of filling activities or dredging activities. It's important to note too that those wetland losses have continued even with a regulatory process. In Virginia, there was little mitigation for projects that were considered necessary, even though they impacted wetlands. So even with a regulatory framework in place, wetlands were lost over time. And of course, this is important because wetlands provide valuable ecosystem services, and the unnecessary hardening of the shoreline contributes to those wetlands losses and ecosystem services. So I know in Virginia, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science started ringing the bell probably a decade ago saying, you know, this is important. We need to take a look at this because the regulatory process is supposed to protect wetlands and ensure their long-term viability, and yet even with the permit process, we're continuing to lose wetlands over time. And so that basically led to a refocus on mitigation and also on living shorelines. So for hardening of the shoreline, what are some of the problems? So the problems with bulkheads is that they will erode wetlands on the seaward side of the structure, and wave energy also travels along the face of the structure, causing erosion on adjacent properties. And in the business, we like to say that, you know, bulkheads are like lawyers. Once somebody has one, everybody has to have one. And so obviously that's a problem. If your neighbor has a bulkhead and you don't want one. Anyway, it's a problem. So bulkheads also break the ecological connection between upland buffers and aquatic ecosystems. And as we've seen in a number of storm events, failed bulkheads contribute to the marine debris and actually can cause additional damage as they get spread across other properties and hit other structures. So they bring with them a host of problems. Revetments, even though they're somewhat better ecologically than bulkheads, also come with some problems. As you can see in the upper photographs, often when a contractor goes to build a revetment, they'll totally clear the riparian buffer just to get access to the shoreline, or sometimes they're acting at the will of the homeowner who wants to improve their view and sort of use the revetment as an excuse to clear the buffer. So that results in a loss of forested habitat, loss of habitat diversity. In the lower photograph, you can see that unnecessary revetments also eliminate wetlands and again decrease habitat diversity. In many times totally in an unnecessary fashion. And there are other threats as well that result in wetland losses. Mowing of wetlands, which seems to be really prevalent in Virginia. I don't know about other states, but we see a lot of wetland mowing occurring because again, people want a manicured lawn aesthetic. So they just mow their wetlands. We have wetland fills based on a desire to eliminate wetlands or just get more usable upland. Construction impacts, then of course, impacts to buffers, which are part of the collective ecosystem along with wetlands. You know, wetlands don't exist in their own ecosystem. They're connected to upland buffers, riparian buffers. So we have all of these threats. And so that leads to living shorelines. And this, again, in Virginia, really the refocus on living shorelines came about as a response to the regulatory program about losing wetland functions and values through the regulatory process. So there was a refocus on reducing or eliminating those permitted losses of wetlands and maybe even getting some wetland gains. And I know here in the city of Norfolk, working with the city itself and their NGO partners like the Lafayette Wetlands Partnership, the Elizabeth River Project, they voluntarily implement living shoreline projects on city property. So we're actually seeing increases in wetland inventory through the installation of living shorelines. So what is a living shoreline? Living shorelines are defined by the materials with which they're constructed. In Virginia, that's mostly using sand, native wetlands plants, sometimes biodegradable logs, like you see in the upper diagram. It can include stone, oyster reefs, which can be either natural or constructed. And now there's actually some exciting research going on with the use of mussels, integrating saltwater mussels into the marsh to provide biodiversity, but also to make the peat more erosion resistant. As far as design goes, there are living shorelines can address elevation issues with sea level rise. We're starting to see a lot of marshes actively drown in the coastal plain of Virginia. They're just getting too deep, and so the marsh grass fades away at the toe end. So you can readjust the elevation, the marsh elevation, using living shoreline techniques to preserve wetlands. You want to address the slopes, both the wetland slope to make it non-erodible, but also, as you can see in the bottom diagram on the left, you want to regrade upland slopes, because if you have an eroded upland slope with a vertical face, that will reflect wave energy just like a bulkhead and cause erosion of the wetland areas. So you want to address those upland slopes as well to be resilient under storm conditions when the tides are 2, 3, 4 feet above normal. So again, why are living shorelines valuable? This is a graphic that compares the benefits and detriments of living shorelines versus structural practices. Some of this information you have to take with a grain of salt. There's a line in there that talks about one looks natural rather than artificial, and we all recognize that aesthetics are subjective. Some people want a mowed lawn right down to the water's edge, so they wouldn't necessarily think that a living shoreline is a benefit. There's information in there about maintenance, whether they're maintenance free on a daily basis, and it says that living shorelines are not. I might argue with that. If they're designed properly, I think they're pretty much maintenance free on a daily basis. So anyway, this is sort of just a general list, not to be considered, perfect, but the main takeaway from this graphic is that living shorelines allow for the maintenance of ecosystem services, whereas most hard structures really eliminate those qualities. So this is one type of living shoreline that we use quite a bit here in coastal Virginia, and that's using a coir log, or they're also called biologs. The logs are made of rolled coconut fiber. They're used in low wave energy regimes because they are biodegradable. So they're used in a location where they're not needed for structural tow protection, just for holding the sand in place until the vegetation and the vegetation's root systems take over. And then they usually biodegrade within a year or 2 years, and then just become part of the tow edge soil. And then the grass, the wetland grass, just holds that wetland in place by itself. And this is an example of a typical biolog installation. You can't see the before picture, but at the edge of the left edge of the wetland grass, there was an eroded scarp, maybe 8 or 10 inches high. They just needed to make a transition between that vertical slope and restore the existing wetland grass, and so the log was put in place. The void behind the log was filled with sand to make a nice gradual transition, and then plants were added to stabilize that area. This is another example of a candidate site, again in a low wave energy regime. The biolog is to be placed where the stakes are. The stakes sort of outline the footprint of the biolog. You can see on the right-hand side of the picture, there's an eroded scarp. You see concrete and asphalt. Here in Virginia, we call those materials of opportunity. When people were breaking up their sidewalks or taking up a piece of road, they would just throw this debris on the shoreline, thinking it would provide some measure of erosion control, but it really just made a mess. So all that material was removed, and I'll show you in the next photograph what it looked like under construction. So in the top picture, you can see the coir log in place. Again, the sand placed behind it, and then a gradual slope up to the existing grade. And then the bottom photograph shows that same area after 2 years, after 2 growing seasons. Here's another example of a core log application. Again, you can see in the top photograph in the left-hand side, there's a small eroded scarp. Trees are being undermined. This was damage that occurred during a hurricane when the marsh was actually underwater. So the wave energy was focused in the upland banks. And so the core log was meant to address this erosion. And you can see in the bottom, the core log was placed, the sand was placed behind that, vegetation was installed, and after 2 growing seasons, it's nice and stable. This is another example where actually the cause of the marsh erosion was geese herbivory. Geese had come in and eaten a lot of the plants in this wetland. So again, the same technique, you put in the core log, put sand fill behind it, and then plant the marsh, and the bottom photograph shows the result. One of the things that we do here in Virginia is we try to add flowering wetlands plants, both for aesthetics, just so you don't have a monoculture of green grass, but also for habitat and biodiversity. Here's another example of a larger project. Again, you can see the core logs on the right-hand side of the photograph, the sand that was placed landward of the biologs, gradually sloping up to the adjacent slope. I don't think the photograph shows it, but we did convert a bunch of that grass on the landward edge of the wetland to a shrub and treed riparian buffer, so we didn't have grass going right up to the wetland. But you can see when you put these little plugs of grass in, we call those, or I like to call those, the hair club for men stage of wetland restoration, where you just have these little spikes. And then in 2 growing seasons, this is what it looks like. So pretty dramatic transformation of a highly eroded shoreline. And then the other type of living shoreline that we use here quite a bit is called a rock sill. It's very similar to what we used to call in the old days marsh toe protection. There are a couple of distinctions in the design. They're usually higher. They don't just go up to the height of the existing marsh grade at the toe. They usually go up to mean high water or slightly above mean high water. They're used in areas where there's a higher wave energy regime so that the marsh toe would continue to erode without that structure. We do put breaks in the rock sill, so that allows the water to get in and out and the critters to get in and out and utilize the marsh, whether it's fish or crabs. They can migrate in and out, and of course over the top of the structures during higher stages of the tide. But there are breaks in the sill, and these structures are also used in areas with high boat wake activity. Again, only when the marsh toe would continue to erode without some sort of structural protection. But the key is that the rock structure is on the outside of the marsh, and it doesn't break the continuity between the aquatic wetland habitat and the upland riparian buffer. There's nothing to stop the wetland from migrating in a landward direction. So here's an example of a site where a rock sill was proposed. You might draw a line between the point in the background and the point in the foreground. That's where the wetland used to be. I won't go into the sediment dynamics that caused this erosion to occur, but nevertheless, there was quite a bit of erosion of this area, which was formerly wetlands. So a rock sill was placed out in the water, and I'll show you in the next slide what that looked like through the construction process. So in the upper left-hand screen, you can see that the stone structures have been put in place. You can see the gaps in the stone structures that allow the water and the wildlife to get up into the marsh at all stages of the tide. The sand has been added in the top right photograph. There's your hair club for men stage of wetland restoration, where all the little plugs are being put in on 18-inch centers. In the lower left, you can see that's after just 5 months after planting. And then the lower right, again, is after 2 growing seasons. So a total restoration of that marsh habitat. within 2 growing seasons, at least the vegetation. And I throw this photograph in there. This is the same area, just taken from an opposite direction. Again, you can see the gaps in the rock sill. But the reason why I put this in there is that this photograph was taken, I think, 10 years after the initial planting. And so what that shows is the durability of living shorelines. That's one of the questions a lot of people ask, like, how long are they going to last? Are they resilient? And this photograph clearly shows that that wetland has survived several hurricanes and nor'easters and major storm events. So if they're designed properly, they're definitely resilient, they're definitely durable. You just have to get the design and construction right. And it's not all that difficult to do. Here's another example of a site that was prime for a rock sill installation. You can't see it, but to the left of this photograph, there's quite a long fetch to the northeast, which is the major hurricane wind direction for us at this site. Again, you can see all the materials of opportunity strewn along the shoreline: concrete, asphalt, very little wetland vegetation. The trees are being undermined. There is some wetlands there, but a very small band, and then the sediments you can't see in the photograph, but the sediments are very soupy and loose and wouldn't support wetland vegetation anyway. So this photograph shows the restoration underway. Again, you can see the rock sill placed out in front. You see the gap in the rock sill to allow the water and wildlife to get into the wetland, and the planting phase here with the plants on 18-inch centers. And this is the project, in this case, actually after only 1 growing season. We had a very mild spring this year. We planted this restoration in April. I think it was mid-April. We had lots of rain in the spring, and it really helped the plants grow and colonize this area quickly. So this marsh is doing super well, and it's just an amazing restoration of the wetland resources. And this project did so well, it actually spurred adjacent landowners to use living shorelines as well on their properties. Just quickly some of the newer innovations that are working their way into living shoreline proposals. The use of, these are called oyster castles. They're like Lego blocks that fit together for mass, and they will colonize oysters. So you can build oyster reefs on the landward toe, the seaward toe of your wetland restoration, rather than just using granite stone. And again, this provides habitat diversity. There are these larger structures called reef balls that basically do the same thing, but they're just bigger and more massive, so for higher wave energy situations. And then you can also use oyster bags, although I have to confess, these are maybe my least favorite because they can only be used in really very low wave energy areas. The oyster shell is put in bags for mass so they don't move around, and if those bags open up or are vandalized, the shell tends to scatter and really doesn't create a reef habitat as you might be looking for. In any living shoreline project, you have to contend with invasive species. In our case, that's Phragmites, and I know I'm running a little long on time, so I'm going to not go into that in any more detail. You also want to treat the entire ecosystem. So again, we've gone from just treating the wetland to making sure that we have a nice riparian buffer associated with the wetland restoration projects that we do. So we'll bring in native trees and shrubs to improve the riparian buffer adjacent to the wetland and to control stormwater runoff. There are planning considerations needed for sea level rise, and those might include upland species. If you're planting a tree that has a 50-year lifespan, and you're going to put that tree just landward of the wetland, you better make sure that it's saltwater resilient or flood resilient, so that it just doesn't die within 20 years because it's getting flooded now. So you want to think about the upland plants you put landward of your wetland. You want to think about the elevation of the wetland that you design. You want to make sure that, again, that's going to last as long as it can under the proposed sea level rise regime. And of course, you want to address the slopes on the landward edge of the marsh, again, as we discussed previously. There are a number of living shoreline publications out there. Two, perhaps, of some of the better ones. On the left, there was a paper put out by Restore America's Estuaries on how to overcome barriers to the installation of living shorelines. That's an excellent report. And then there's a new book that was just edited by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science called Living Shoreline. It just came out last year, and it's got a wealth of information about living shoreline projects all across the country. And then there are a number of design publications also that talks about how to design living shorelines. And of course, you should reach out to other resources as well, like the Society of Wetlands Scientists, the Association of State Wetlands Managers. NOAA's got some good living shoreline publications. And then there are some training modules through the Virginia Association of Wetland Professionals and the North Carolina Coastal Federation. I'm sure there are others out there, but with a little bit of online research, you can find a wealth of information about living shorelines. And
okay, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin Du Bois. I appreciate you staying on time. I think we're just 1 minute over, so we're doing pretty well. I want to remind the participants that we are going to be taking the questions at the end. So I'm just using the time that you submitted them to be able to read the questions to the right presenter, or you may ask it of both of them. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and have Kevin Irwin go ahead and give your presentation.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank the SER and SWS for inviting me to join you guys today, and I hope you're a little cooler than I am down here in hot, wet, and very sunny Southwest Florida. I'm going to talk to you today about two very different projects. One is a coastal tidal project, Little Pine Island. The other is an interior freshwater wetland project in Central Florida, that being Lake Wales Forest. I'm really going to only have time to whet your appetite, so to speak, today. So I hope that you'll follow up both with SWS, SER, and myself and Kevin Du Bois on the questions that you have on our presentations later on. First, I want to talk about Little Pine Island, which is in the middle of the Charlotte Harbor National Estuarine Sanctuary. And it's a rather long history. It's an interesting project in that it was a public-private partnership. As you can see on the timeline here, we basically have over 20 years of data now on this successful restoration project. I am not going to talk today about the fact that it was a mitigation bank, the first full-service mitigation bank in Florida. That would be a presentation for another time. Here you see the location in the middle of the estuary. Little Pine Island's about 5,000 acres in size, and we began with an ecological history, being that the site was drained by mosquito control activities back in the 1950s and 1960s, which incidentally did nothing to control the mosquito population. They had the opposite effect. It did drain the island and took the freshwater lens in the middle of the island and replaced it with salt water. And the disturbance allowed exotic species such as Brazilian pepper and casuarina and others to come in and completely dominate the site, both the freshwater areas and the salt marsh areas and some of the mangrove areas. These are some of the activities that took place here, some of which at that time, back in the early 90s, was groundbreaking work dealing with herbiciding and protecting seed banks, how to encourage seed banks. It involved removing a tremendous amount of biomass, on the average of about 60 tons per acre on this site. And we were able to make a deal with a power company to have that material taken to a facility and burned as biofuel, and the money that we got paid for us to remove all that biomass from the area. Our initial baseline studies showed very, very low utilization by native species. And as time went on in the restoration and the monitoring we did, we had a tremendous rebounding effect long before the restoration effort was actually completed. Doubling the mammal species, tripling the bird species, almost tripling the number of wetland-dependent bird species. The same with reptile species, and where we had no native fish, now we had more than a dozen species of native fish. Because it was a mitigation bank, there were a number of success criteria that involved biodiversity. All that biomass, as you see in the upper left-hand corner with the zero, was removed by hand, and it was picked up with tracked equipment, track hose, and removed from the site. You see there, as we go clockwise, the stumps. They were cut down low enough so that we would be able to get quicker degradation. As you see in the lower left-hand corner, after a couple of years, you can see how the stumps of that melaleuca begin to deteriorate. And not only did the stumps deteriorate, but all of the root mass at the surface decomposed, thus eventually returning the elevation of the island back down to a more normal pre-disturbance condition, which in effect had a huge positive impact on the island's hydrology. Removing all that biomass was the sexy part of the restoration project. What was not very sexy was the weeks and months and even years it took to backfill all of those drainage canals, and many of those running through sensitive habitat, as you see here. But over a period of 10 years, that activity resulted in restoration of the native habitat in the area, whether it was salt marsh or mangrove, as you see here, or freshwater habitat. Here you see the operation going full bore with the melaleuca, as you see here, the stand of melaleuca in the upper left-hand corner actually being loaded into a chipper grinder. It gets blown into the back of a semi-tractor trailer and taken off to the power plant. We dealt with a tremendous amount of material, but also a lot of material that was left on the ground that many thought might be problematic. We actually had no problem with seeds or stems. We had pretty rapid degradation of those materials. The algal mats, the periphyte that you see there in the lower left, actually aided that decomposition. But as you see in the lower right, it looks like Nagasaki in 1946, as we did this project phase by phase and removed all of that exotic biomass from the site. Pictures tell 1,000 words. We put a lot of these kinds of photographs in our reports to agencies and those that were interested in our activities. This is one of more than 60 permanent photography stations that we had on the site. You can see the dramatic difference once the exotics are removed and you begin to return the site to the normal hydrology, but you still see all of that duff that's still left on the ground following the operation that still has yet to decompose. Here's a photograph of one of the large drainage canals being restored on the side of Pine Island Road. It was kind of funny as we started to do this. The agencies were inundated by not dozens, but hundreds of calls from people driving up down the road thinking that developer X was moving into the island to develop home sites. So we quickly had to plan a lot of public meetings where we could access the public and tell them what we were really doing. Here's one of those temporary access roads after about 5 years of recovery. I can give you those details at a later time, but basically they're logging roads that are constructed in a temporary manner on filter fabric and hay bales, so that when we're done, that low impact road can be taken out back to natural grade and allowed to let the seed bank recover itself. We did almost no planting in this 5,000 acre island to achieve the success that we did. Some of the long-term management things that were activities that we're engaged in, of course, include prescribed burning on the island, and this is an ongoing activity now to maintain the hydric pine and the marsh communities, the freshwater marsh communities on the site. Very good recovery. So about 5 or 6 years ago, this is what the island actually looked like. So you compare this photograph with the first photograph I showed you of those temporary access roads being built and the exotic forest being cleared. There's quite a dramatic, difference, both in the mangrove habitat, the salt marsh, the freshwater marsh habitats, and in the hydric pine habitats. This is part of the Florida Park Service now, and it's open to the public for hiking and recreational use. No vehicles are allowed, but in the wintertime, great place to go bird watching. This second project I want to talk to you about this morning is on a degree of difficulty scale where Little Pine Island might have been a 7, Lake Wales Forest is about a 15. Because of the fact that this is more of a true ecological restoration project, because it involved both uplands and wetlands in Central Florida, and it has quite a history. The site was actually designed to be drained and cleared by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. That's what they did for agriculture back in those days, was drain the swamps. And once that design was completed, the landowner took about the better part of 20 years to actually dig the canals and clear the forests to convert all that land, nearly 500 acres, to agriculture. We used this site, after looking throughout Central Florida, as a regional site to compensate for impacts from a pipeline project, because it had great potential both for upland and wetland restoration. And right after receiving the permits in 2000, we actually started our baseline data collection before that, but developed a design and implemented it. And took the better part of 10 years to meet all of the success criteria and go into a long-term management phase. The best news of the day, though, was a few years ago, the property was donated by Gulfstream Natural Gas to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is now part of our Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. There was some, major areas that we explored with this project. The first of all, which was, had to do with people working together, was it was done under what's called team permitting in the state of Florida, and where we had all of the agencies working together. I know it sounds strange today, but we had every agency from the Corps of Engineers to the local county people, all of the state people, in meetings together to issue simultaneous permits for this site. It really helped us get to success a lot quicker. This site had, as I said, had a high degree of difficulty and risk involved, because it involved hardwood swamp restoration. It involves xeric scrub and upland, a very sensitive and rare upland restoration, and a number of endangered plant and animal species recovery targets. We instituted at that time what I call now reverse farming. We used farming techniques a little differently to be able to implement our restoration. Dealing with the wetland seed bank was extremely important for this project. But when we get in that hot, dry sand in the xeric scrub areas, there is no seed bank because we don't have those hydric soils to protect biological activity. This also was a private-public partnership. And like the Little Pine Island project, we hope that when our federal government once again starts to receive applications for Ramsar sites, that this will be a future wetland of international significance, a Ramsar site. And it's not the typical Florida landscape being up on the Central Florida Ridge where we have hills and sand, which somewhat complicates the restoration. And we have a small area on the site that was not significantly damaged by the farmers' activities, and this was, one of our reference areas. But this is what the hardwood swamp looked like before it was drained back in the 1960s. Typically water depths of 1/2 meter or more and prolonged hydro periods exceeding 9 months in duration. And when we started the restoration back in 2000, this is what that hardwood swamp looked like. So, it's hydric soils, you have to take my word for it, but it was very dry. It had been drained by 2 meters or more from the agricultural activities. The SCS and the farmer did a very efficient job in pulling the water out from under the ground on this site. And when we did our analysis of where the water was, where the jurisdictional areas are, you can see that, the only thing that's left is that herringbone network of drainage canals and some of the wet pasture areas in the xeric scrub that used to be prolific and productive isolated freshwater marshes. Lots of endangered species on this site because of that relict, scrub, such as the sand skate. So, what this means is that, water is everything. And in this particular case, these sand areas are water storage areas for the wetlands at a lower elevation, but they're also home to a number of endangered species like this sand skate that you see here. Some of the baseline data collection that we did was install wells, piezometers, staff gauges, and rain gauges throughout the site and on some of the adjacent properties. The data collected was used to develop a water budget, and from there to be able to develop a restoration model for the site that would actually put these habitats back in place by really manipulating the water table so that we could take advantage of whatever seed bank was left in the wetland habitats. So when that data is collected and the models produced, it actually gives us a conceptual restoration plan. You can see here by all the squiggly lines here, those are different habitats that are projected to emerge once that water table was reestablished. And then each one of them, and we developed a basin concept by which we put in water control structures to cascade the water from the west, which would be your left, to the east, which would be your right. The outfall being a canal that goes on into Lake Arbuckle to the east of the site. So this is the restoration design, if you will, that we used and implemented. And the technique that we used was on both the uplands and the wetlands involved eradicating all of the pasture grass on the site, which was problematic, especially in the wetland areas, because the rhizomes of those pasture grasses run so run so deep. So here you see the upland in the foreground, that xeric scrub with the sand, the bare sand after it's been sprayed, and about halfway through the kill of the exotic pasture grasses in a portion of the hardwood swamp, which was turned into pasture. So here we are farming that area. Once that kill is complete, you see the dead pasture grass there in the foreground. We would till it, and that was basically to cut the rhizomes, bring them up, get them along with the seed bank now excited, so to speak, so that it would germinate it. And then when we felt it was the right time, we would go in and hit it again with herbicide, and we would continue that process through through just short of 2 full growing seasons. This is another part of that hardwood swamp restoration site. You can see that even without being irrigated, you know, the soils are still obviously hydric and damp. And we were able to restore this site back to its natural conditions simply by installing these 4 structures on the site. But it's important to note, I would tell you that I actually enhanced the drainage of the site while we were doing the work, just to make sure that water didn't back up on us, which would make working with equipment very sloppy and cause more damage to the site than we wanted to have. And here you can see after the structure was put in, the water level starting to come up in the hardwood swamp portion of the site. Our structures were very sophisticated. They were actually, I designed them so that they were a combination of recycled plastic and aluminum gates on them. And these fit in those agricultural ditches. We actually used the ditches that the farmer dug to help to back up the water to the design elevations on the site. And even the wetlands that were in the middle of that sand scrub, which are fairly difficult to restore simply because of the different drainage conditions, here you can see starting to rebound. One of the things that you don't see, except by looking at the well monitoring data after putting in those structures, is the fact that the wetland elevation came up about 2 meters. But the elevation under that sand and those sand hills came up several meters in vertical elevation. Here you see the hardwood swamp starting to, it's actually now a freshwater marsh. And at this stage, it's ready to receive plants during the oncoming dry season, which in Central Florida is the winter and in spring. Protecting the soil was everything, and by doing that, getting the hydrology correct and the exotic vegetation out, the trees that were planted really took off, and we had exceedingly high growth rates. This is after 1 growing season. This photograph at one of our monitoring stations there. The freshwater marshes were essentially at success levels in less than two growing seasons as far as species diversity, richness, and cover. And we planted many thousands of trees in that hardwood swamp restoration section simply to speed up or compress succession in that area, since the areas surrounding the site were mostly citrus groves, and so we didn't have many areas for those seeds from those tree species to come in on their own. The xeric scrub was extremely difficult back in those days. There was not much scrub restoration, going on. So the first job was to remove the exotic pasture grasses. And if you look closely, those little things that look like mole holes, you'll see some of the planting of the rare upland species that you find in the scrub. I chose not to remove the exotic pasture grass once it was dead, simply because that was the only thing holding the sand together at that point. It was also helping to keep a little moisture in the soil at that point. Where did we get our seed? Well, we got it from the Avon Park bombing range, just a few kilometers away. We harvested that seed, brought it to the site, used basically a manure spreader to distribute the seed material on the site. And we actually mixed some hand-collected seeds from other locations in with that, depending upon what areas we were seeding on the site. When we do large restoration projects, the techniques we favor first are working with the seed bank and then direct seeding in place. That's what that ground cover looks like when it's when the seed harvesting is ongoing. And after about 10 years, this is what that xeric scrub area actually looked like. The killer in this type of restoration is the fact that the microclimate on that sand, when those seeds have to germinate, exceeds 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes 120 degrees Fahrenheit or more. And if you don't get the little bit of rain when you need it, then you have a crop failure. And we did have one of those on this site, just from the fact that we had the wrong kind of weather at the time when we really needed to have that seed germinate. If you look at that slide at the bottom there, I want to show you that you see the citrus grove there to the right. And these were our neighbors. And when we started this project, they were more than just antsy about what we were going to be doing. I think they had visions of, you know, their orange trees popping up out of the ground and flowing away. When in fact, you know, from the data that we looked at, they were having a tough time because of the scarcity of water in the area. So needless to say, they were extremely pleased when we brought that water table up enough for the pumping to be easier, and for those trees really to that water to get close enough to the root zone of the citrus that they didn't require nearly as much irrigation. So we were really happy to be able to work with the farmers and improve their livelihoods at the same time that we improved the site. Here's what that hardwood swamp and marsh looked like after about 10 years following time zero, so to speak, on the site. You see up the upper left one of those old farm ditches that we used to rehydrate the site behind one of the 4 control structures. One of the deep marshes that was restored on the upper right, and then the forested hardwood swamp community down the bottom two slides. Trees on the site today exceed 8-9 meters. The percent cover from the last data set we collected in 2011 or 12 was just exceeding 45%. I would say roughly today it's probably around the neighborhood of 80% canopy cover on the site. And those ditches, they will gradually fill in with biological debris. So if you fly over it today, you know, this is what you see. The hydrological restoration was the real key to this project, both in the uplands and in the wetlands. You can see by this photograph taken in 2012 the distinction between the xeric scrub and the hardwood swamp. And you know, this restoration's had a significant increase in biodiversity because of the restoration of wetland habitat and xeric scrub habitat. And now that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is maintaining it as part of the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, you know, we hope that it'll be available for future generations to enjoy. So with that, I'm finished, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin Irwin. So we are just now hitting 2 o'clock, and so I hope that folks will get to stay around for the questions and some closing announcements that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Rebecca and I will be asking the questions. First, I'm going to start with Kevin Du Bois. Let's see. One of the questions, I think you have one that's, everybody's very curious about the core logs. One, they want to know, can they be installed in salt water? And then the other questions about the biologs is, do you have problems with buoyancy? And should you incorporate some kind of rebar stake through the logs and angling them with wooden stakes? Is that usually enough? We'll have to get...
Give me the first question first, and then I'll answer the second question second.
Okay, I'm sorry. These are all about the core logs or biologs. And the first question was, could it be installed in salt water? Because I guess it's made of that coconut fiber. Is that acceptable, or do you have degradation at a different rate?
Yeah. All those photographs where I showed core logs, those were all saltwater applications. So absolutely, they can be installed in salt water. Commercially, they come in different densities, and so that directly affects how quickly they'll biodegrade. So, and we learned that sort of the hard way. We got some of the lower density ones, and they biodegraded even, I think, not before the first growing season was out. So now we only use the high density core logs, and those usually last 2 growing seasons, but they're totally suitable for saltwater applications. We use them all the time.
Right.
What was the second part?
The second one was about the buoyancy of these biologs, and is there, like, should the designs incorporate rebar, stake through them, or angling wood stakes? So what is usually enough to keep them in place?
They definitely will float, and so they do have to be staked. I don't know if it was evident in the photographs, but we do use wooden stakes. The contractors actually have specifications on how many, stakes every 8 feet, I think it is. And we take pine stakes and sort of put them in a crisscross pattern to prevent the logs from floating up. So you can try to drive stakes through the logs, but they're very dense, and so it's very difficult to do that with the wooden stakes. So we just put them on the outside, the wooden stakes on the outside of the log, and like I said, crisscross them to keep the log from floating upward. But you definitely have to stake them. And when, contractors who really didn't know how to install core logs were winning bids, sometimes they weren't even unwrapping them. They'd come wrapped in plastic, and they'd install them with a plastic wrapper, and they wouldn't stake them down, and then they would just float away. And so, yeah, you definitely have to stake them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'll let Rebecca ask Kevin Irwin a question.
Great, yeah, so this question can go to both of you, maybe after Kevin Irwin answers. So this question was about long-term monitoring, and how long do you monitor these sites after the restoration work has wrapped up on the ground?
I see. How about the native plants?
Well, that's a good question. It's definitely important to conduct long-term monitoring. That would be the monitoring that you would conduct after time 0. And depending upon the project, some projects are permit driven, others, for mitigation, others are not. But when you're working with, especially with complex projects like the 2 that I presented, one of the reasons for doing that long-term monitoring is because it's going to help you with your management. The fact that we have to engage in adaptive management is important, on these restoration projects, whether they're upland or wetland. It's going to tell you how often you need to conduct a prescribed burn in a restored upland area. It's going to tell you whether you need to adjust your water control structures in wetland areas. So, there is no specific rule of thumb on the duration, but it is something that you definitely want to incorporate and consider, when you're, putting your restoration plan, together for the project sponsor.
And I would agree with Kevin. The monitoring really depends on the purpose of the project. For us, Living Shorelines were designed for shoreline stabilization. So the monitoring is much less rigorous than what Kevin Irwin is looking at. We're just trying to make sure that the shoreline is stable. So you'll get a very quick view of how well your plants are coming in the first growing season. And then after that, you just want to monitor it for invasive species. You want to make sure after storm events, periodically you check to make sure that the vegetation is still holding. But again, the monitoring is more casual and less rigorous than if you were, designing a wetland mitigation project or something like that had more criteria for success associated with it. So.
And actually, Kevin Du Bois, that brings up another question someone had about, and maybe it answers it, about the living shorelines type of restoration being recognized for mitigation. So is that generally not, whereas Kevin Irwin's Little Pine Island was one of the first full service mitigation banks, obviously that is applicable to mitigation. So are these living shorelines applicable?
Well, in a regulatory context, the reason why living shorelines, there was a focus put back on living shorelines was to maintain wetland area and function. So in that aspect, I mean, they are looked at as it, I don't know if mitigation is the right term, but you are trying to accomplish saving acreage and function of wetlands by creating living shorelines. Sometimes there's a conversion of ecosystem types. You may fill a mud flat to get the proper grade for living shorelines. So sometimes there are trade-offs. And that's why I don't necessarily equate living shorelines with wetland restoration, because they're designed for a specific purpose for shoreline erosion control. But the main take home, and I know there's a lot of debate about that, about should they be considered and monitoring be conducted just like you would for a wetland restoration project. But I think the main take home for living shorelines for shoreline control is they're a much better option than a hardened shoreline. They're always going to perform better than a bulkhead, always going to perform from an ecological standpoint better than a revetment. So really you're just trying to make sure that you get your vegetation in there, it's stabilizing the shoreline, and it provides those ecosystem services that a hardened shoreline would not. So.
Thank you. Thanks. Rebecca?
Great. Yeah. So this is a question for Kevin Irwin about estimating cost per acre of restored wetland habitat. And is it possible to estimate what the cost per acre would be considered a good value versus what would be considered excessive for the effort put in?
The cost would be spread out over.
Looks like we might have lost Kevin Irwin there in the connection. We'll see if he pops back on. Kevin Du Bois, could you perhaps answer that in terms of the projects you were working on, and we'll see if we can get Kevin Irwin back?
Yeah, it's very difficult to get sort of a standardized cost per linear foot, because it really depends on the goals and objectives of the project, and that's going to determine what your slope is. If I have a 2-to-1 slope for wetland restoration or a 5-to-1 slope, that's going to mean 5-to-1 slope, I'm going to need a lot more sand fill, and that is going to increase the cost per linear foot. So it really depends on the goals and objectives of the project. And I know people ask that question all the time, like, okay, if it's under $100 a linear foot, I'll do it. But if it's over $100 a linear foot, I won't do it. And what I've really tried to do is to get people to not emphasize the cost per linear foot so much as the value that the project provides, because living shorelines provide all those ecosystem services. It's providing fish habitat, it's providing oxygenation of the water, it's taking nutrients out of the water, all those things that bulkheads and revetments don't do. So those values are not calculated into just a per linear foot cost. So instead of cost, we ought to be thinking about what value does that system provide. And I think that's a better economic way to look at that question.
And I think for whomever asked that question online, if they want to go ahead and email Kevin Irwin and ask him that about his project, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer that question. I have a question about invasive species. There's questions for both of you about that, but I really like the way this one is worded. How do you control for weeds and invasive species during the Hair Club for Men establishment process in your projects, Kevin Du Bois?
Well, in the intertidal zone, there aren't that many things that can survive. We really don't have to worry too much about invasive species, although Phragmites can come into play. So we will monitor for Phragmites invasion, and we will either spray it with a backpack sprayer or hand treat it to try to get it early as it comes in. And that's just something you have to monitor and manage on a long-term basis. If there was Phragmites there in the past, you certainly have to monitor it, because rarely do you get it all 100%. And it will also come in, and if there's a seed source in the area, it will come in from time to time. So it's something that you have to manage, and you just have to determine how frequently you're willing to engage in management and what those costs would be, and that sort of determines how you attack the issue.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rebecca?
Just to kind of get an understanding of how your
Sure, yeah. So I guess we'll stick with questions for Kevin Du Bois at the moment. We're trying to reconnect with Kevin Irwin here. Looks like, so in one question we have says, in the Living Shoreline photos, there were fine strings visible across the recently planted grass, and just wondering what those were for.
Yeah, those are designed to keep geese out of the wetland. The wetlands, when they're first planted, root systems are not developed, and so they're highly vulnerable to geese predation. Geese in our area, even though they're supposed to be migratory, they do not migrate in the winter because people feed them. So they sort of stick around, and then in the winter, when people stop feeding them, they become very hungry, and so they start looking for other sources of sustenance. And these newly planted marshes with immature root systems are very easy to take advantage of. So that string that stretches across the top of the posts keeps the geese from flying into the marshes and getting in there to eat the plants. And you might have seen that there's some mesh fence around the marshes, and that's to keep the geese from swimming in and walking into the marshes. And you keep that up for a growing season, maybe 2, until the plants mature, and then you can remove all that, just because the density of the vegetation will keep the geese out.
So I have a question about the materials that you used. One person asked, why did you use sand and not soil? And someone else said, what is the source that you get the sand from? And what kind of application method did you use? Did you just use construction equipment, or did you do thin layer deposition?
The reason why we use sand is because it's porous, and it will allow, when the tide comes in and out, it allows the marsh to drain properly. Some of the projects that we've had problems with, I suspect that the area was flooded too much, and it was just too stressful an environment for the plants. Once they start to mature, the plants will take up water and transpire that water, and actually will regulate the soil hydrology a little bit. But when they're small and new, they're getting flooded over the top, and they're saturated a lot, and that's a really difficult way to start out life. So the sand provides, it's heavy, it won't erode as easily as maybe topsoil. It provides the right hydrology and drainage for the plants to become established. And sandy systems are natural in this part of coastal Virginia. That's kind of a natural environmental type. So that's what we use, and it works super well. Over time, as the root masses degrade and stuff, the organics will increase in the soil, and it'll become more and more natural over time. In the projects that you saw in the picture, we truck the sand in from upland sources, So we're not dredging and you know, sort of thin spraying those areas. It's all upland construction sand, and we have specifications for the grain size in the sand, again, to provide for the correct porosity and density of the sand, so it doesn't wash away.
Okay, I think maybe Rebecca will go ahead and we'll stop the questions there. We do have a few we didn't get to, and if you didn't get your question answered, we have on the screen now the email addresses for both of our speakers today. Before we leave, I want to go ahead and kind of plug our next seminar. I don't have control again here, so maybe Kevin or Rebecca or Tony, you have control. There we go. Our next SWS webinar is going to be on August 16th, and while that's exclusive to SWS members, we will hold a free quarterly webinar in September. It's going to be about wetland restoration, and we hope the SCR members can join us once again. So we hope to see you there. And next slide, please.
And SCR's next webinar in August is going to be co-hosted with our SCR Great Basin chapter. So this is going to be about post-fire restoration in the Great Basin, involving presentations from several of our members from that chapter.
And then finally, Rebecca wanted to introduce something that SCR is excited about.
Yeah, so this is a new project of ours, which we are really looking for other folks to contribute to. So this is our Restoration Resource Center. It's an online crowdsourced interactive database, and this is a place where you can explore both restoration projects and restoration resources. So the projects, right now we have about 215 from 51 countries, and these are projects that are in every stage of the restoration, from planning to implementation to monitoring. You can learn about lessons learned, design, outcomes, funding opportunities, and we also have a wide range of resources. So these include books, peer-reviewed articles, white papers, technical papers, and representing all these different biomes you see here. So we're especially interested in folks to contribute as well. So if you hop over to the next slide, one of the important things about this resource is that's crowdsourced. So we're looking for folks who are practitioners to submit their projects in and grow this database, so that way you can connect with other folks who are working on similar projects. You can share ideas, share lessons learned, planning, things like that. So feel free to head on over to the website at the bottom of the screen here and check it out, submit, and also submit comments and questions. We're really looking for this to be a living, growing database for years to come.
And finally, the next slide, I just wanted to announce that we currently have 2 student SWS wetland ambassadors. This is a program we started last year. We have Tatiana from Mexico and Arohi from India, and they're working with their mentors in the US and Canada. So these students are supported by a grant from SWS, and we started our very first crowdfunding campaign in May through CrowdRise. So we want to provide some funds to our incredible wetland ambassadors. So if you would please consider donating any amount, we're trying for $2,000 for our first drive to support these students from developing countries. And you can go to our campaign webpage. You can link to it on the SWS webpage under Awards and Grants drop-down menu. So finally, with that, I really want to extend my thanks to Kevin Du Bois and Kevin Irwin. Unfortunately, he couldn't get back on the line. I guess they had a big storm down there in South Florida, like we often do during the summer. So thank you for taking time out of your busy kind of globe-trotting schedules to present an SWS SER webinar today. And also thanks to my co-host. I think that our first co-hosted webinar went quite well, Rebecca, and so thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
and then finally, thanks to our audience for attending today. And remember that you can use the PDF to find out any of this information that we might have gone over quickly, or to get the contact information for our speakers, and go ahead and email them and ask them all the questions you want. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.